Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Janice Law. I'm the founder of American Women Writers National Museum. We're a 501c3 charity. We're 12 years old. We used to meet in our mission is to honor America's great women writers, historical and contemporary. We used to meet in person at the National Press Club, but after the pandemic, a lot of things at the press club changed and everybody started going to Zoom. So at least for the foreseeable future, we're going to be on Zoom as well. Our speaker today is Stephen Ennis. Mr. Ennis is director of the Ransom Center in Austin, Texas. I'll let him tell you a little bit about what the Ransom Center is. And he also holds the bachelor's degree from Davidson University. He holds a master's degree from Emory University and a doctorate degree from the University of Georgia. So I give you now Mr. Dr. Steve Ennis. Thank you, Dr. Ennis.
Thank you, Janice. It's a pleasure to join you all today. I will briefly describe the Ransom Center, but I'm going to say more about the center in the course of my remarks. But before I do that, apologies if I have a cough or during this talk. There's something here locally in Austin called cedar fever this time of year, and I think I've succumbed, but at least there's no chance of anyone contracting it through a Zoom meeting. In answer to Janice's question, the Ransom Center really is one of the country's leading humanities research centers, and I will say more about that in just a moment. But we're particularly strong in literary archives, that is the personal and creative papers of some of our finest writers. And it's very much a global collection, not just American, but British, French, Commonwealth countries, heavily Anglophone, but not exclusively. The center also has extraordinary theater holdings. The archives of Arthur Miller and Tennessee Williams are both here, for example. We have extraordinary depth in the history of photography, including the world's earliest surviving photograph from 1827, the Niepce heliograph. Strong performing arts collections, remarkable art holdings as well, most notably Frida Kahlo's great masterpiece, self-portrait with thorn necklace and hummingbird. But as you see from the types of collections I've mentioned, the Ransom Center is very much focused on human creativity in all of these forms. And unlike some special collections, we don't collect historical collections broadly, but focus on the creative figures at any one given historical moment. But I'll tell you a little bit more about the institutional history in the course of my remarks. First, I want to thank Janice and Don for the invitation to speak with you about the center and some of the many writers whose papers we're honored to hold. Before telling you a little bit about that story, though, I want to note that from its earliest history, the rare book and manuscript collections at the University of Texas have largely been built by a series of women librarians and archivists, even as all 6 of the center's directors, myself included, have been men. The same social conditions that have produced that circumstance have also manifested themselves in a variety of ways in the lives of the women writers I want to talk about today. The Ransom Center was established as the Humanities Research Center in 1957. And that was the year that Russia launched the Sputnik satellite into Earth's orbit, setting off, as we know, a massive investment of federal dollars in science and technology here in the US. It was in that Cold War context that Harry Ransom, a former English professor who had risen to become chancellor of the University of Texas system, called for a commensurate investment in the arts and humanities. In his words, I propose that there be established somewhere in Texas, let's say in the capital city, a center of cultural compass, a research center to be a bibliothèque nationale of the only state that started out as an independent nation. From the beginning, the Humanities Research Center he envisioned was entwined with narratives of nationhood, a bibliothèque nationale in the capital city of the only state to have once been an independent republic. The Humanities Research Center, as it was first called, was a new framing of what had been, in fact, a long history of collecting at the University of Texas. And to a large degree, the new center cast that previous history into shadow. But if one goes back to recover something of that prehistory, one finds it was a woman named Miriam Lutcher Stark, who made her husband made his fortune in timber, who donated to the university the very first major rare book collection. This was not any ordinary collection. It contained 4 of the first folio editions of Shakespeare, as well as highly significant manuscripts of Charlotte and Emily Bronte, including a remarkable manuscript draft of a novel called The Green Dwarf that Charlotte wrote when she was only 17. A very similar manuscript, also written when Charlotte Bronte was a teen, was just purchased by the Friends of the National Library on behalf of the British Library for £1.25 million. But this collection came, as I say, as really a foundational collection for the university's rare book and manuscript holdings. And it's worth noting that it was consistently identified as Miriam Stark's library. Not that of her husband, but Miriam's. During these early years, and for almost 40 years, the presiding figure over these holdings was a woman named Fanny Ratchford, who presided first in the old library building, as it was called, and later in the rare books room of the main building, where she is said to have hosted afternoon teas and literary discussion. This was, of course, a type of collecting that we're all very familiar with, essentially collecting the great works of English literature. But jump forward to 1957, Harry Ransom knew that his Bibliothèque Nationale would never achieve the distinction he sought by trying to catch up and rival the much older and more established collections of the East Coast universities, some of which had been building collections long before Texas was even a state. It was for that reason that Ransom emphasized collecting writers' original manuscripts, material that by its very nature was unique and would never be duplicated by any other institution. It followed that to collect original manuscripts, one needed to collect from the writers themselves. As a result of Harry Ransom's position and influence, the new Humanities Research Center grew at a phenomenal pace in these early years. During a period, I would add, when British institutions and many American ones would never even consider the acquisition of a living figure's papers. Much has been made of this archival brain drain from the UK, but the short version is that UK libraries were simply not engaged and not competing for such recent contemporary material. The English poet Philip Larkin launched an early campaign to address this cultural imbalance, which he dubbed in another gesture to the Cold War, Operation Manuscript. But it would be decades before the British Library and other UK-based institutions began to compete in earnest with the American upstarts. Early acquisitions in the 1960s, during this period of phenomenal growth in the history of the Humanities Research Center, included the papers of the heiress and publisher Nancy Kennard, a large tranche of the papers of the poet Marianne Moore. The archive of Carson McCullough's followed, remembered today, of course, as the author of The Heart as a Lonely Hunter. Also in the 1960s, the archive of the Alfred A. Knopf Publishing House began coming to Austin, which it's worth noting is to a significant degree the creation of Blanche Knopf. As Laura Claridge's recent biography makes clear, Blanche was the literary tastemaker in that firm's history. In the archive, one finds the English translation of Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex and the files of some of our finest earlier 20th century women writers, including Willa Cather, and later mid-century American writers Shirley Ann Grau, Ursula Le Guin, and Sylvia Plath. All writers, I would note, whose careers coincided with the Ransom Center's explosive period of growth. Let me proceed then without some slides, but an archive that I wanted to talk about in greater detail than the ones I've briefly highlighted is that of the American confessional poet Anne Sexton. And I did have some images from the Sexton Papers and Art Collection. Let me just describe briefly a couple of those. Okay. The Anne Sexton Papers that are here are not only her working manuscripts, but also the Anne Sexton Papers are not only a collection of her literary papers, but also her art collection. She was an amateur artist, and one of the images that I hope to show was a portrait of a woman very much inspired by Van Gogh's swirling bright blue skies. But in the foreground, the woman's face has been totally obliterated and is blank. It's called in Anne Sexton's description, a woman without a face. And the other item I wanted to show were some notes from the Anne Sexton Papers where Sexton comments on a recent class visit at Oberlin College, which has gone particularly well. And she writes in those notes, "I was a charm. I demanded commitment and started to learn how to put love and teaching together." And thirdly, there is in these images a reel-to-reel tape, which is simply a recording of one of her poetry readings. But what's most noteworthy, perhaps, about the Sexton archive is that also included on audio tape are extensive recordings of her sessions with her therapist. More about that in a moment. Anne Sexton, as some of you may know, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1967 for her collection Live or Die. And tragically, she took her own life just 7 years later at the age of only 45. Along with Sylvia Plath, she was, as her biographer has noted, one of the first American poets to make feminist issues accessible to broad readers everywhere. In another manuscript I'd hope to show, she writes, "To tell the truth, I'm a recluse, hesitant as Emily Dickinson, a recluse, yes." In many ways, Sexton's life of catastrophes and melodramas, and that's her daughter's description of her life. In many ways, Sexton's life foreshadowed her death, and in the final year of her life, Sexton took a number of specific steps to prepare for her own death. She hired a secretary to organize the papers, which she placed on loan at Boston University. She consulted a trusted colleague about the naming of a literary executor, and she wrote a will to make her posthumous wishes known. Sexton's own daughter, Linda, takes up the story from here in a remarkably detached and impersonal statement, writes, "Anne Sexton made me her literary executor on my 21st birthday." Diane Middlebrook, Sexton's biographer, speculates that Sexton may even have delayed her own suicide until her daughter and designated executor turned 21. As Linda later wrote of this personal trauma, "Many uncomfortable decisions and tasks fell to me after she killed herself." Linda was only a senior at Harvard when Houghton Mifflin proposed that she edit a selection of her mother's letters. Linda spent months going through the letters on deposit at Boston, working in a glass cubicle where, as she has recounted, she faced, quote, "staggeringly personal material." "Hiding my face in the file folders to seek privacy where there was no privacy to be had." Anne Sexton, A Self-Portrait in Letters, was published in 1977 to great critical acclaim. And with the completion of that edition and no longer requiring access to the papers themselves, Linda turned to the sale of her mother's archive. A young editor at Houghton Mifflin named Jonathan Galassi was aware of the collections being assembled at the Harry Ransom Center, as it was now called, and he made inquiries on Linda's behalf to learn whether this rapidly growing center would have an interest in the Anne Sexton papers. Warren Roberts was director at the time, and he expressed early enthusiasm for the acquisition. He retired, however, in May of 1978, and acting director John Payne, followed by Carlton Lake, took up communication with Linda and reaffirmed the Ransom Center's interest in the archive. Reviewing these administrative files from this distance, one cannot help but be struck by the belief all three directors had for her work. The Anne Sexton papers now at the Ransom Center have been heavily consulted by students and researchers over the intervening years, and the archive was the primary resource for Diane Middlebrook's 1991 biography, which famously and with much controversy made use of those therapy tapes that I mentioned a moment ago. Linda Sexton continues her careful stewardship of her mother's legacy. In 1994, she published Searching for Mercy Street, My Journey Back to My Mother. With Linda's help, we continue to add materials as they become available to the still growing Anne Sexton papers. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of Sexton's death, meaning the archive has already had a longer life than Sexton had herself. It is, of course, that endurance that helps explain the power of a literary archive. The Anne Sexton papers will continue to be consulted by researchers another 50 years from now and 50 more after that. As Diane Middlebrook has argued, Sexton can't be seen separately from the period of the flowering of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy in the U.S. In other words, she is both a product of that historical moment and also a means back to it for subsequent generations of readers. The Ransom Center has always collected such material, the papers of some of our very finest writers. You will find here as well the papers of Nobel Prize-winning novelist Doris Lessing, whose 1962 novel, The Golden Notebook, recounts the efforts of the fictional Anna Wolf to record her own life in 4 notebooks and her effort to reconcile these different strands in a 5th called The Golden Notebook. It's a story that examines some of the same pressures that Sexton was responding to in her deeply personal poems. But as I've said, British institutions remained largely passive in collecting the country's living writers, and the English book and manuscript agent Anthony Rhoda, understandably, turned to the Ransom Center in 1999 to offer us the archive of this major American British novelist. When Doris Lessing received the Nobel Prize in 2007, she was the oldest person to receive the prize. We continue to add to all of these highly important legacy collections, and I was pleased to have a role in helping to facilitate a large addition recently to the Doris Lessing papers. More recently, we were delighted to discover in the papers of the American novelist Liza Alter a substantial correspondence between Alter and Lessing. Alter had lived in London in the late 1970s. It was then that she and Lessing had become friends. And Lessing took an early interest in Alter's writing and helped to get her 1975 coming-of-age novel, Kinflix, published in the UK. Other recent acquisitions, just to give you a sense of the breadth and the continuing activity around women's archives, include the papers of Julia Alvarez, most well known for How the Garcia Girls Lost Their Accents. Lily Tuck, winner of the National Book Award for Fiction for her 2004 novel, The News from Paraguay. Novelist Joyce Maynard, author of Looking Back, a chronicle of growing up old in the 60s, and other autobiographical writings about her relationship with J.D. Salinger. We recently acquired Janet Sternberg's editorial files related to her influential anthology, The Writer and Her Work, contributors to which included Julia Alvarez, Margaret Atwood, Anita Desai, Joan Didion, Erica Young, Maxine Hong Kingston, Ann Tyler, and Alice Walker, among others. Sometimes the very survival of an archive speaks to the conditions out of which a writer works. And I'd like to say a word about a recent acquisition of a British novelist, if I may, the papers of the novelist Rachel Cusk. The Cusk papers are modest in size and fragmentary and incomplete, but the archive's physical disarray speaks in some way to the conditions for writing that she experienced as a woman and as a mother. When we acquired the Cusk archive, Rachel Cusk reflected in notes at the time on her own writing life and what evidence of that persisted in these fragmentary papers. She wrote, "Most of my work has been written while bringing up children. I've had very little time alone, and I've had to hold a great deal in my head," was how she put it. "My physical world was fragmented," she wrote, "scattered everywhere by the weather of domestic life and its cycles of servitude and change and destruction and renewal." Handwritten notes for her adaptation of Medea and notes for her autobiographical memoir Aftermath on marriage and separation are just a few of the things that one can find among the Cusk papers. She added, "I don't know whether my writing process has developed because of my particular circumstance and the life I've lived. I have never had very much privacy," she went on to say. "As a child in a large intrusive family and then at boarding school, I wrote diaries that people openly read and were provoked by. The diary was the first form in which I found any power." Rachel Cusk's outline trilogy was critically acclaimed for the erasure of the silent central figure of that novel, who we learn about only through the overheard dialogue of those around her, something like Anne Sexton's painting of a woman with no face. In that manner of telling her story, in that self-erasure, she found a means of telling a story about the invisibility of women everywhere. "Sometimes," Cusk wrote, "I tried to create a record of my mental life, to collect some orderly evidence for it. I would hold on to draft manuscripts for a while, but if they didn't get used to light a fire or for the children to draw on, they were abandoned in the next house move. Against the force of emergency, of enactment, of live action that runs so strongly through family life, I could never exert myself to defend these testimonials to my past work, and perhaps my work became a living thing to me in a way it otherwise wouldn't have done. I did, however, keep hold of my notebooks. Most of them show evidence of daily life trampling through them. They were far from sacrosanct, far from being the writer's room of my fantasy, but being small and lightweight and easy to carry. They survived." Rachel Cusk surviving notebooks, Doris Lessing's Golden Notebook, and Sexton's poems that sometimes read like suicide notes, are each in their way a record of a writing process and at the same time distinctive testimonials about our time. From the beginning, the Ransom Center has collected such records, the papers of some of our finest and most gifted women writers, and that work remains ongoing. I would add, the Ransom Center also supports, in a direct way, the study and understanding of these archives through fellowships that support work in the collections. And though women continue to face barriers to full participation in the Academy, I'm pleased that fully half of our fellowship applicants and awards go to support early career women scholars. Just a few recent publications supported by our fellowship program include Alice Adams' Portrait of a Writer, Christine Brooke Rose in Post-War Literature, and Sybil Bedford, Appetite for Life. What I've been sketching for you so briefly is an important part of the Ransom Center story, one that is also illustrative of the life cycle of an archive, from identification of work that merits our continued attention to its care and ultimately to new readings and interpretations. This is the work of the Harry Ransom Center. While an archive may seem fixed and contained, it is in fact a remarkably organic thing that requires our continued re-examination and retelling in each new cultural moment. That's the work my colleagues and I are committed to, and it's been my pleasure to share this very brief account of it with you this afternoon. And I'd be happy to respond to any questions that you may have about the center or these collections. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Ennis. We appreciate it so much. You can email questions to me at onum, American Women Writers National Museum 1 at gmail.com, and I will forward them to Dr. Ennis.
All right, I'd be happy to follow up offline with those if there are none here today. Yeah.
Oh, yes, yes. Where do you want to give the website or the way of contacting the Ransom Center?
Sure. Well, questions could just be emailed to my email address, Ennis at austin.utexas.edu, and Ennis is ENNISS, 2 N's and 2 S's.
Okay.
But I hope some of you might have perhaps visited the Ransom Center or heard about its work. It's similar in a number of ways to a number of other very fine special collections across the country, including, I see we have Leslie Moore's here, including the Houghton Library and the Beinecke Library and Bancroft and a number of others that are engaged in very similar work, preserving the legacy of our best writers, both in the past and in the present.
Okay. And I didn't realize myself that Miriam Stark and Fanny Roseford, is it? Roseford,
yeah,
were the women who started the Ransom Center. That was fascinating. What year was that? What year would that have been?
Well, that was the late 19th century when the gift of the Wren collection, it was called, first came to the Ransom Center. But it is notable, I think, that that collection was very much identified as Miriam's collection, even though the source of wealth for building such an extraordinary collection came from her husband's timber collection. It was always the Stark Library, and remains so today. So part of what I was trying to suggest is that when Ransom had a very ambitious vision for creating the Humanities Research Center, he was building it on a legacy that paradoxically was cast into shadow by the creation of the Humanities Research Center. So one needs to go further back for these origins, and one encounters immediately the role of a number of women in building these collections, which continues, of course, to the present.
Yes. Also, I will tell everyone, you can access this video of Dr. Ennis in about 3 or 4 days on our website. So if you missed it, you weren't able to attend, or any of your friends would like to watch it, it will be on our website in about 4 days. It takes us that long to get together and post it. But we thank you so much, Dr. Ennis. You were so gracious about everything, just a model of graciousness, and we really appreciate that.
Well, thank you for what you're doing, and I'm delighted to be with you all, and be happy, as I say, to follow up on any questions via email that anyone may have post-talk. So
okay.
By all means, don't hesitate.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending.